It's the story of Holland America Line. So let's start with the Holland part. Now, this is the Netherlands, and I know it can be a little bit confusing, but saying the Netherlands isn't really the same as just saying Holland, because Holland is actually a province. Well, technically it's two provinces, North and South Holland. So, why Holland America Line? Well, because of this. Now, this is Rotterdam, a city in, you guessed it, South Holland. Today, it's by far the busiest port in Europe and one of the largest ports in the world.
The Netherlands is, of course, located perfectly in Europe as a gateway to Europe, we like to say, because the rivers go through to Germany, Belgium, France, and the whole of Eastern Europe.
Rotterdam is situated in a natural delta, and that means as a port, it caters to somewhat 350 million people. Until this day, trade comes into the port of Rotterdam, either in containers or goods, breakbulk, and is then sort of divided into smaller portions and then taken upriver.
More than 100,000 ships pass through the port of Rotterdam, representing nearly 50 billion euros of value for the Netherlands every year. 50. And just for perspective, that's 6% of the gross domestic product of the country, all from these 41 square miles of port. But in the late 1800s, none of this was here. See, Rotterdam was a tiny city with a bit of a problem. The river mouth was very shallow, and if a ship wanted to come into Rotterdam, it had to take a long detour through canals and rivers. It added days to the journey, which wasn't good for business. So, a group of entrepreneurs got together and they hatched a plan. They dredged the river and make a new waterway to the sea, and it was a game changer.
In those days, we had what we call the havenbaronnen, the port barons as we call them, entrepreneurs, people who were looking for opportunities, and Anthony Platen, Lodewijk Pincoffs, and Otto Reuglin. They started the North American Shipping Company.
Now, they formed the company in 1873 and called it this. Now, for any of our guests who don't speak Dutch, if you want to give this one a try, the Nederlands-Amerikaanse Stoomboot-Maatschappij. Oh, close enough. Actually, in Dutch, the I and the J together is sort of pronounced how a Y is pronounced in English. Now, our first ship was called, of course, Rotterdam, and we painted her smokestacks the colours of the city, green and white. Now, the Rotterdam was built in Scotland and cost 30,000 guilders, millions and millions of dollars today. Now, she was supposed to have this big, splashy debut, but there was a strike at the shipyard and she arrived 6 months late. Now, because of that delay, her first voyage was a little bit light. She only carried 70 passengers. It was an inauspicious start for our company. And actually, our first 20 years weren't, let's say, spectacular. And a lot of that came down to our name. See, it was hard to sell tickets in America on the Nederlands-Amerikaanse Stoomboot-Maatschappij. And everyone was sort of already calling us something else anyway. So we did what these days you'd call a rebranding, and we went from this to this. And that was really the last time we were behind the curve. And by just a few years later, we'd already taken over 1,000 trips with nearly 500,000 passengers. And things were only going to get better. Holland America Line was about to join one of the largest movements of people in the history of the world. Now, for as long as America has been America, people have traveled from far away to make a new life in the United States. Before Holland America came around, it was expensive, it was difficult, and it was often extremely dangerous. Now, in the early 1800s, before our steamships, the voyage across the Atlantic was pretty miserable.
Immigration from, of course, the point of view from the Netherlands started in the 1830s. Sometimes they sailed as regular passengers with their own cabin, but most of them didn't have a lot of money because poverty was a reason to migrate, and they stayed in between decks. So they didn't have their own cabin. They just stayed in whatever bed was provided for them.
Those tween decks, or what you might know as steerage, where most of the immigrants travelled, were often tiny and extremely uncomfortable. Often they were only 5 feet tall. Now that passage could take almost a month, and the conditions were often miserable. By the time our steamships came around, things had gotten a little bit better. The trip was shorter, but the conditions on the other liners was still pretty terrible. And yet here's the thing, nearly 11 million people immigrated to the United States in steerage. So we had to figure out how to get some of those passengers. And look, it wasn't going to be easy. Competition was ferocious, especially because the other companies were, well, let's just say they're a little willing to play fast and loose with the truth.
It cost $10 to cross from Rotterdam to New York. $10 to an immigrant in the beginning of the 20th century was a lot of money. And they wanted the voyage that was safe and reliable. Immigrants were poor people, basically. They didn't go to travel agents, they didn't study brochures, but they'd go down to the railway station or the pub or the post office, and they would see these giant posters of liners going to America. So word spread that a ship with 2 smokestacks was safer than a ship with 1 smokestack. But a ship with 3 smokestacks was even safer. There's no correlation between smokestacks and safety, but they would look at the posters and count the smokestacks in the posters and pick that ship to spend their $10 on. Well, companies, thankfully Holland America didn't do it, used to add fake smokestacks to their ships so they would have more stacks on the top so the immigrants would go on their ship, so they called them dummy smokestacks. The second big story of that era, the immigrants had heard that if they ate raw onions for a month before they left Europe, they wouldn't get seasick. Total fallacy. There's no correlation between raw onions and seasickness.
Okay, first of all, we'd all appreciate it if you don't try that raw onion cure on board. Science has offered us plenty of methods to treat seasickness that won't make you a social outcast here on board. But the point is this, Holland America Line had to figure out how to get those immigrants on board our ships. And again, we weren't the fastest, we weren't the biggest, and we certainly weren't the cheapest. And we definitely weren't going to cheat by adding fake smokestacks to our ships. But despite all of that competition, eventually 1 out of every 10 immigrants who traveled steerage to the United States did so on a Holland America Line ship. 1 out of every 10. And you know why? We treated those immigrants like human beings deserve to be treated. And it all started at home in Rotterdam.
So here we're actually at the Wilhelminapade, but at this side it's called Holland America Quay. And this is the main street, you can say, in Rotterdam. So basically, where we're at, this square kilometer is the history of Holland America Line. Just on the opposite side, you have the Royal Yacht Club, where actually the deed, when it was started, the company, was signed, dined, and wined. If you walk a little bit up along the quay, you will find Hotel New York, which was the original head office of Holland America Line. And I have heard so many stories of people going there, trembling knees, and how happy they were when they finally got on board.
That building, which served as both our offices and terminal, is really where it all started. You can still see our name on the facade. Now downstairs, immigrants came to purchase their tickets and get ready for their long journey. Actually, the baggage area is now a really nice restaurant with an amazing view. Upstairs were the offices, and today there's still a few rooms that are named after our company's founders. Now, after the migrants purchased their tickets, they'd wait for the ship to arrive to take them to America. Sometimes they'd wait a few hours, but usually they waited for days and days.
When they stayed in Rotterdam, up till the 1890s, they mostly went, or I think all of them went to private boarding houses. And in the earlier days, the people of the boarding houses, well, they were not that fair in the prices people had to pay. And people like Pleet and Reuglin, who were the founders of the Holland America Line, also saw this. So at the end of the 19th century, they built their own emigrant hotel.
They built it just a few blocks from our head offices, And it was a huge part of the reason they were so successful in those early days, because this was much more than just a hotel. We had a kosher kitchen, there were English lessons, classes on American civics, and doctors and nurses who checked for lice and diseases. And when the immigrant finally got on board, they found something that was totally different from our competition. First, we did away with steerage class altogether, renaming it Emigrants Class, where unlike our competition, we served 3 square meals in an actual mess hall to every passenger. For example, here's a menu from the turn of the century. Looks pretty good, right? Let's take a look at Monday. We've got sauerkraut, smoked bacon, potatoes, plum duff, anyone? Sort of like a Yorkshire pudding, but our first class passengers, they had it even better. Oysters in the half shell, seared duck. Now, by the way, I don't know if you noticed this, but this ship was called Potsdam. We've repeated a lot of ship names in our history, but there's never been another Potsdam. It works in Dutch, but I guess it didn't quite sound right in English. Now, offering 3 square meals in the dining room, it might seem like a small thing, but it was actually this massive innovation, because it meant that 3 times a day, rain or shine, those passengers could leave their quarters and their rooms could be cleaned. Now, very quickly, we got the nickname the Spotless Fleet. And this wasn't just about being tidy. Everything from the doctors at our hotel to the cleanliness on board our ships was all about getting passengers to New York in a healthy condition, because healthy passengers made it through Ellis Island.
Just south of where I am right now is Ellis Island, the great immigration station, where from 1892 to 1924, 18 million people passed through. Now, the immigrants were not allowed to come up to the piers of New York. The ship had to drop anchor south of here in the lower bay, and they would take them off in barges, tenders, or ferries, and all the third-class steerage passengers would go directly to Ellis Island, where beginning at about 9 in the morning, they would be processed by gruff customs and immigration people and doctors known as 30-second specialists, as they hooked under eyelids and poked into ears looking for diseases. They were processed, and many of them were cleared by noon, would catch a ferry over to Manhattan or even here to Jersey City and start working in a factory the same afternoon in a prearranged job. They wanted to be Americans quickly. They wanted the idea that the streets were paved with gold. You could make your riches in America.
By the way, if a passenger was rejected at Ellis Island, you know who had to pay for the return voyage? We did. But that's only a small part of why we did all of this. The main reason was that people that made it through told their friends and relatives about us. Almost 99% of the immigrants that we carried on our Spotless Fleet were cleared at Ellis Island. Now, word spread about our fine service on board and business was exploding, and so it was time for us to build our first luxury liner, the New Amsterdam. Now, I could talk all about her, but I'm going to let the New York Times do the honors.
The New Holland America liner, New Amsterdam, reached Hoboken after her maiden passage across the Atlantic yesterday afternoon. The ship, which is the largest flying the Dutch flag, as well as the best passenger vessel yet built for the New York-Rotterdam trade, resembles outwardly the other Holland America ships. There is a Dutch smoking room, a Japanese tea room. The social hall is furnished in the Empire style and will surely be one of the most popular apartments on the new ship.
It was a really great first review. Now, by the way, you might notice that the original New Amsterdam had masts. It never used sails, but they put masts on the ship to assure worried immigrants that the ship was safe and sound. Sort of our version of those dummy smokestacks. But it worked. Immigrants flocked to Holland America Line, and the stories are endless. Johnny Weissmuller, the original Olympic athlete and very first Tarzan, he immigrated to the United States on Rotterdam 3. Herbert Hoover, Cary Grant, Katharine Hepburn, Clark Gable, Deborah Carr, and Louis Armstrong, they all traveled on Holland America Line ships. And hey, we can even take credit for some of the greatest comedies of the last 50 years. Billy Crystal's grandfather emigrated on one of our ships. So without us, Harry would have never met Sally, there'd be no city slickers, so you're welcome. But of course, there's also this recognizable fellow.
Oh.
He traveled to the United States for the very first time on board one of our ships, the Rotterdam, the fourth Rotterdam, the flagship of our fleet, and our very first ship of state. Now, Rotterdam 4 was built in 1908, and she was amazing. She was the largest ever Dutch ship, and she was the official seagoing palace of the Royal Dutch government, sort of the Dutch version of the SS France or the Queen Mary. She was also the first ocean liner in the world to have a glass-enclosed promenade deck. Now, that might not seem like a big deal, but it would actually be 4 more years before another ship had such a modern and forward-looking feature. And that ship was the Titanic. Now, actually, the Titanic is part of our story in more ways than one. In 1912, when White Star Line launched the Titanic, one of our founders sent his son George to scout this new ship. He dined with the ship's designers, he met with officials from White Star Line, and he sent telegrams to the captain of the Noordam, a Holland America ship, that was crossing the Atlantic just ahead of the Titanic. Now, the captain of the Noordam actually warned him of the ice ahead, and if you listen carefully in the film, you can hear our ship being mentioned. But, of course, it was no help. Our founder's son was among the 1,500 that perished on that tragic voyage. But tragedy wouldn't stop us. World War I didn't stop us, or immigration quotas, not even prohibition. We just continued to do what we'd always done, and we found a way to think differently.
In 1929, Wall Street crashed, and the passenger ship industry to Europe plummeted by 50%. A million people crossed in 1930, 500,000 5 years later. So Holland America, like all the companies, was hemorrhaging money. So in America, we had prohibition. You couldn't drink. So they developed an idea of one-night cruises for $10, where you would sail from New York at 5 p.m. You would get to the 3-mile limit at 7 p.m. They could open up the bars legally because they were past the 3-mile limit. Americans could drink themselves through the whole night and hopefully be sober enough to walk ashore the next morning. $10 booze cruises. Cruising was like Hollywood movies in the 30s. It was a form of escapism. So Holland America emphasized the nutrients in sea air. It would calm the nerves. You'd worry less about your financial troubles. You'll come back renewed.
Now, our approach to prohibition was actually so successful that despite the Great Depression, we built our most luxurious ship ever, New Amsterdam II, still considered to be, along with the Normandy of France, one of the most beautiful ships ever built. Again, I'm going to let the New York Times handle this one.
British observers who landed at Southampton after making the overnight journey to inspect the ship were deeply impressed with her, not only as the most modern thing in marine architecture, but also as a distinct and unique achievement in art. The New Amsterdam is the greatest ship ever to come out of Holland, and those who have seen her predict that she will produce a sensation in New York unlike that of any other vessel in the North Atlantic trade.
Sensation really was the perfect word for New Amsterdam II. She was our very first ship to feature something called ocean liner design. See, before New Amsterdam II, our ships looked like, well, home. They had dark interiors with fireplaces and heavy fabrics. You were supposed to feel like you were on shore at a Dutch villa, not actually out at sea. But with New Amsterdam II, we tried something different.
It was Art Deco at sea. It was magnificent. It had everything right about it. It was floating ginger arches with sleek stainless banisters and ebony and modern decor. Out went the chocolate rooms and the heavy carpets. She was instantly one of the most popular ships. In fact, she was dubbed the ship of tomorrow because she was so modern inside.
With New Amsterdam II, we even revolutionized the entertainment on board. See, in the early days, our lounges featured a piano for guests to play like in the parlors of the old country. But that was the onboard entertainment. A few drinks and the hope that someone else crossing the Atlantic with you would be able to play a few popular songs. Well, we still do the few drinks part, but now we provide the piano player, and that all started on New Amsterdam II. It even had an entire theatre. New Amsterdam had performances from all kinds of artists, and fast forward 100 years, we went from this to this. The past was gone, and the ocean liner was the future. But less than a year after New Amsterdam 2 made her very first voyage, everything changed.
War breaks out in Europe. 2 days after Germany's surprise attack on Holland, France and England have declared war on the Nazis. With widespread fighting imminent, countless civilians are left to wonder, where will we go that is safe?
My parents literally smuggled themselves across the Polish border in early '39.
We arrived at the Rotterdam train station around midnight on the 25th of March, without any money at all. We spent 2 weeks in Rotterdam waiting for the ship to sail. Finally, one evening in early April, we boarded our ship. For the first 3 days, our vessel threaded her way carefully across the English Channel to avoid the mines.
It was tense all the way. There were frequent rumors of U-boats and of turning back to Europe. At night, the ship was blacked out, dark. The potholes had been painted over, drapes and curtains were drawn by late afternoon, and only low wattage bulbs were used in the lounges and in the cabins.
We were in the English Channel, and the war had started, and the ship turned out all the lights, and we laid all night in the English Channel because of fear of submarines. And then the next day we started the trip to New York, and partway through the trip we saw the ocean all around us was covered with logs. There was a Canadian lumber ship that had been torpedoed by the Germans, and we picked up the survivors.
On the day we finally rounded Land's End and headed out into the open Atlantic, the ship's radio brought us the news of Hitler's surprise attack.
Rotterdam was bombed. The whole city center was bombed. Around 850 people lost their lives. Around 20,000 people lost their home, which is a lot. And also, the harbor, the port was bombed.
During that bombardment, one of our largest ships, the Statendam, was hit. In the midst of this destruction, this symbol of our company burned and burned for days and days.
A lot of people were emotional about it. That the Statendam was it was burning, and they tried to save it, but they couldn't. The whole city center of Rotterdam was burning. I mean, 30,000 buildings were gone. You can't imagine how it must have been for people to live in the city at that moment. All those people having no homes, the fire, there was no water. Everything was broken. It must have been awful.
The Dutch government had wanted to be neutral, but now they just had no choice. The war had come to the Netherlands, so they called on the Dutch ships of state to join the war effort. New Amsterdam 2, our most luxurious ship yet, was to become a military vessel. Now she steamed to Halifax, where her military conversion began. From there, she went to Singapore, where her millions of dollars of furniture and art were placed into storage. And on December 22nd, 1940, she entered service.
At the outbreak of World War II, I was in South Africa.
That's Cecil Renfield. When we interviewed him, he was 97 years old. He joined the Navy in South Africa and was transferred to the British Royal Navy to join the battle for Europe. The only way he could get home to fight was on board New Amsterdam.
Before the war, I was a cabin boy on the old Orient line, and I knew a lot about merchant ships. And I knew about the New Amsterdam was, I would say, the pride of Holland in those days. Wow, it was the biggest ship I'd ever seen or ever been on. When we got on board that troop ship, it was packed. We were packed like sardines. If you lifted your head up, you cracked your head on the bunk above you.
All of these troop carriers, they were just extremely crowded, and New Amsterdam was no different. Before the war, she could carry a little more than 1,200 passengers. But during the war, at her capacity, she held over 8,000 troops at a time. Even the swimming pool was filled with enough bunks for 300 soldiers. And despite these cramped conditions, New Amsterdam maintained that world-famous Holland America service. For example, while most troop carriers only managed 2 hot meals a day, soldiers traveling aboard New Amsterdam was treated to 3 square meals. And the amount of food needed to feed these soldiers was frankly mind-boggling. Every single day, the ship's kitchens went through 240 gallons of milk, 80 bags of flour, over 12,000 eggs, 1,000 pounds of bacon, 14,000 loaves of bread, and when lamb stew was served, it was 110 whole lambs needed. And when beef brisket was on the menu, it took 4,000 pounds of beef in a day. Now, by the way, just for comparison, these days, we use about 5,000 fewer eggs each day. But on the other hand, we have way more seafood and ice cream and a lot more booze, so it balances out. But it's funny, what Cecil remembers, it isn't the brisket or the eggs, it's actually something much simpler.
The feeling of fear was always back of your mind. We'd heard through what we call the grapevine of so many other ships being sunk. And it was quite strange because on the New Amsterdam, we had no